what I need to know is Schoolcraft. Who is Schoolcraft, and how did he contribute to this area?
There was long dispute between the United States and Britain back in the early 1800s about just where the Mississippi River started. Nobody knew for sure, except the Indians, of course. And the commission that was supposed to negotiate the boundary between the two countries, what is now Canada and the United States, each side wanted the source of the Mississippi on their side of the fence. But there were no accurate maps. Henry Schoolcraft received permission to lead a party to the source of the Mississippi. To do so, he had to hire Indian guides, because Indians, of course, have lived in this area for thousands of years. Thousands. If you want to know how many thousands, on the shore of Lake Andrusia, during recent highway construction, were found the remnants of an old fishing village that were dated 5,000 years. And all around Lake Andrusia, there are ancient grave sites and portage trails. It's been used for a long time. When Schoolcraft made his trip back in the 1830s, his Indian guide showed him a number of shortcuts. They didn't actually travel the Mississippi River for lengthy stretches, because there were quicker and easier ways to make the trip. It was Schoolcraft who named Lake Andrusia for Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, and that's ironic because Andrew Jackson had a reputation, and he earned it, for not being a friend of the Indians. So here in the middle of Indian country, you have a lake on which the Indians had lived for so many thousands of years, named for someone who removed virtually all of the Indians from the eastern portion of the United States. At any rate, the stretch of the Mississippi from Lake Andrusia to Lake Bemidji had a very special Indian name. They called it Medaswin. That means 10, the number 10, because there were then 10 rapids between Lake Andrusia and Lake Bemidji. Most of these rapids are now covered up as a result of a dam having been built. And the course of the Mississippi at one time was quite different from what it is now, because it flowed, and we think through Big Lake, and entered Lake Andrusia from the north, and flowed out on the west side of the lake, which is where the fishing village was found, into Wolf Lake, out through Little Wolf, and back into Cass Lake, through what is now Allen's Bay. We know where that channel was. This lake, Andrusia, had a long, long history among the various Indian tribes who at one time or another lived here. And Schoolcraft's trip through the lake, although he is recorded in the history books as the discoverer of the Mississippi, the source of the Mississippi, of course, the Indians knew the source of the Mississippi long before, so one might say they discovered it. The Indian presence around this lake, therefore, goes back a long, long time. This is a place where maple sugar was harvested in the spring, where fish were caught and dried for winter food, where wild rice was harvested. There used to be large rice beds in and nearby Lake Andrusia and the neighboring lakes. So it's had quite a history. And on the banks of Lake Andrusia today, on the south shore, is one of the oldest Indian cemeteries, graveyards with grave houses, anywhere in this part of the world. And of course it is the Indian custom, the traditional Indian custom, to erect the grave houses much as Christians erect cemetery gravestones and so on. And once erected, to let them disintegrate over time, to let them weather and go back to the earth just as the physical body goes back to the earth. This is why many of the older grave houses that still can be seen above the ground look to people who don't know any different to be ramshackle. They are not ramshackle at all. They were spanking brand new at one time, but it's not considered by Indian people to be appropriate to paint them and keep them in repair. That would be contrary to their purpose.
I didn't know that. I mean, I've seen this for years, but I didn't know what the reason behind that. There's a door. Did at one time they put food in there?
It's the custom also to leave a tiny door, perhaps 2 or 3 inches square at one end of the grave house, where feast food is presented for the dead person's spirit journey to the spirit world. All kinds of stories about that. Indians have been teased about it. They've been asked, well, do you think the spirit will actually eat this food? And their answer quite often is, well, do you think the dead person will actually smell the flowers that you put on their graves? It's the same idea. It's symbolic, it's a spiritual expression. And because this lake, Andrusia, is in the heart of the Indian country, it might be appropriate to explain that to the Indian people who live around here, and who have lived around here for so many thousands of years, consider everything in creation to have a spiritual content and value. A rock, a tree, an animal, an insect. And if hard pressed and asked, well, do you think a spirit actually inhabits this rock? They will say, no, it's not a physical thing. It is a spiritual thing. And it's important to us to respect everything that the Creator put here, including a rock, including a tree, including an animal, and including a lake.
Let me jump subjects now for just a little bit. Do you have any knowledge of this? There's a location on the northwest corner which has been called Whiskey Mary's Point. I think her father was Chief Blue Eyes. Do you have any information to add talk about Chief Blue Eyes or Whiskey Mary?
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
Okay. Swenson Lake and Stocking Lake. Let's start with Swenson. Any knowledge about Swenson? What I'm steering to is talk about the canal that we see from the air today. If we take an airplane and fly between Swenson, Stocking, and Andrusia, there's a very straight line going through the swamp into Stocking. What is that line about?
Let's talk about Swenson Lake, that extraordinary body of water, which is a neighbor of Lake Andrusia's with a tiny Stocking Lake in between, which is so unusual. It's about 3 or 4 miles long, oval in shape, 2 or 3 miles across, and there appears to be no inlet and no outlet. It's a remnant of the glaciers. And the water is so clear that when you fly over the lake, you can see bottom, although it's quite a deep lake. And there is what appears to be a channel, or what used to be a channel. It's filled in now with brush and debris and dirt, between Swenson and Stocking Lakes, and from there to Lake Andrusia. And the tradition around here is that when the loggers came through at the turn of the century in the early 1900s, that a trench was blasted from Swenson Lake to Stocking, from Stocking to Andrusia, for the purpose of floating the logs into Andrusia, and there, of course, the Mississippi River picks up and they could be floated downstream to Cass Lake. And as with all the logging of the big pine, and this was big pine country, great white pine and Norway pine, red pine. The logging didn't last long. It didn't take long. 2, 3, 4, 5 years for all the big pine to be cut and to have disappeared, and for the temporary channels, such as the one from Swenson Lake, to fill back in, for the temporary roads to grow over, and for the temporary railroads to be pulled up again as the logging companies came in, took the logs, and moved out again. And many of the loggers stayed behind and homesteaded. The Swenson family among them. I believe there were 4 or 5 brothers who homesteaded adjoining pieces of land and who have become a very prominent and respected family around here.
Let me switch to Stocking Lake.
Don't know much about it.
Okay. Do you know anything about the logging camp that was on there at one time? Okay. Do you know anything about the big sleigh full of logs that went through the ice in Andrusia? Have you heard anything about that?
No.
Okay. Ever hear anything about Grimley's losing a bunch of cows on between Stocking and Swenson?
I don't know about the Grimley's loss specifically, but I know that it was a common occurrence for farm animals to wander into soft ground, get mired, and to be lost, despite tremendous efforts to pull them out. Horses, cows, so forth. Because there are streaks of deep peat beneath the seemingly solid ground, as road engineers and builders have found out to their consternation. And some of these veins of peat go very, very deep indeed. And this peat, which is slowly decomposing organic matter, is very soft. It acts like quicksand. And many of the lakes around here are very deep as a result of the glaciers moving through here and then melting. But the accumulating residue of organic matter, and it decomposes very slowly, is another matter. So we have here, right around Lake Andrusia, sand country. A lot of sand from ancient lake bottom, overlaid by deep beds of peat. Along the banks of the Mississippi and some of the other rivers around here, you find outcroppings of a very rich clay. Not much, but enough to enable Indians long ago to make pottery, which they used for cooking and containers. And I have also found around the Lake Andrusia basin over the years remnants of pottery that is about 2,000 years old or older, and we can tell that from the ornamentation on the pottery rims. This was laurel pottery, and some of it even older. We find around here also in the Lake Andrusia Basin, copper ornaments, spear points, and so on. And bear in mind that the copper was mined about 25 miles offshore from Grand Portage on Isle Royale. And this copper, very rich, very unique, easily identified as coming from that particular source, was mined then. And you can still see the old mine shafts on Isle Royale. And it was traded over much of this continent. Some of it has been found in Oklahoma, in upstate New York, as far as the Rockies, just as objects from far away have been found here. Some of the arrowhead, spear point, and so on that we find around Lake Andrusia, have found, come from rock that is found no closer than Montana. And if you think that that is extraordinary, bear in mind that skeletons found near Pelican Rapids, about 100 miles from here, back in the 1930s, were carbon dated to be between 9,000 and 12,000 years old. And the man, there was a man and a woman, the man had with him a conch shell, a large conch shell, which the closest place from which that could have come would have been the Gulf of Mexico. So the trade existed back then and long before then, long before then.
Let me jump questions here. I know we're jumping around. The river that goes between Wolf Lake and Andrusia, I'm trying to remember. Someone tell me that was very heavily with bulrushes. It was difficult to get a boat through back in the 20s and 30s. Somebody else says it was wide open and beautiful and sandy. I'm confused in which it was. Any idea what it was those days? Have you heard anyone talk about it?
I've never heard contrary. The river between Wolf and Andrusia Lakes was free-flowing and wide open. Now, it's entirely possible that during a low water season, that there would have been growth along the edges, in which case it was most likely wild rice and not bulrushes.
Oh, yes.
And I have seen during good rice years, the rice in the river, along the riverbanks of the Mississippi between Wolf and Andrusia Lakes has taken up most of the open area. But don't fool yourself, the water's deep. I wouldn't try walking in.
No, I don't think I would either. Let's go to some history based on some of the resorts on Andrusia. I believe that Joe's, what's known as Joe's Lodge today and then, was probably the first resort on lake, and if that's the case, do you know who built it?
No, I don't, and I'm sorry I don't have any first-hand information about which resort went in when and who built them.
Did you ever see the main lodge at Andrusia Lodge? Ever go in there at all?
No, I haven't.
Okay. They did some archaeological diggings over by Ekstrom's place.
Yes.
Who was they, and what did they find?
The archaeological dig at the Ekstroms is the old fishing village site that I told you about. Mm-hmm. And this was first uncovered in the course of highway construction when Beltrami County Road 8 was widened about, this is 1998, and this was about 6 or 7 years ago. And halfway through construction, as they were moving dirt, they found evidence of Indian habitation, and under state law they had to stop and call in the archaeologists to examine just what this was all about. And this was how the fishing village was discovered, and this was how they also found proof that this had been the ancient riverbed for the Mississippi flowing out of Lake Andrusia.
How did they determine it was going out and not in? Any ideas?
Through aerial surveys and other evidence, they found that this was the outlet.
Well, interesting to know, looking at some photographs of Swenson Lake and looking at property lines, we discovered, we meaning the surveyor's office and Mr. Patnell's office, that there may be 20 acres that just gently got washed away as Swenson Lake started moving back. We were looking at something, and there's 20 acres that's not there anymore. So the lake has enlarged throughout time.
Well, it's common for shoreline to erode, and that process of erosion is speeded up by motorboats if the speed is not controlled.
Okay. When in the past, when they think that the Mississippi came in through Big Lake and Andrusia, does anybody have any time frame when that got switched, and even how?
The how would have been through the force of the water, trying always to find the easiest, softest, and lowest place to move to. About when, we can't be sure. All we know with certainty is that that's the way the river flowed 5,000 years ago.
Okay, that's
and when the course changed, I don't know. And I suspect it may have wandered and meandered through several different places before it found its present one. However, there's a tradition that where the river flows into Lake Andrusia now, maybe a quarter of a mile before it enters Andrusia, on the high bank, on what would be the north side of the river, were traditional Indian ceremonial grounds, where there were seasonal gatherings and ceremonies held for many, many centuries.
Speaking of that area, I recently saw an old county map that shows the road going between Stocking and Andrusia. It was the main road coming out of Cass Lake going to, don't know where, Black Duck, Bemidji perhaps.
I think you're referring to the old Red Lake Trail, which for many years was the only road around here from around the 1840s until the 1900s. And this was a wagon road from, I believe, Crow Wing, which is 11 miles south of Brainerd. Brainerd didn't exist then. That was a railroad town, 1890s, 80s, I believe. Came through the so-called Indian Agency, a few miles south and east of Walker, today's Walker, at Onegum, and from there to Red Lake. And this was the connecting trade route and travel route. And before that road, the only way you could travel when there were no roads was by canoe. And of course, Lake Andrusia was on one of the major canoe routes, north and south.
Which connects to Cass Lake, and what I've heard from the individual, and I can't verify it so far, was Cass Lake 4 separate lakes, and then they put the Knutson Dam in, and it made it into one? Is that a correct statement?
No.
Okay.
There's nothing to indicate on any maps or any oral history that Cass Lake was anything but what it is today, with Star Island in the middle, and a rather wide swampy channel into Pike Bay of Cass Lake. And that channel has been much narrowed by fill. Used to be much wider.
You can get through in a boat today, I noticed.
Right. And an ancient trade route was from the south end of Pike Bay through a series of very short portages into Leech Lake.
Well, Leech Lake became large because of the dam that was put in there?
I have heard that story too, but there's nothing to indicate that Leech Lake was of any other configuration but what it is now.
Well, let me.
The building of the dams did enlarge the lakes around here. This is particularly true of Winnibigoshish, but also of Leech and Cass. And when the dams were built, the rising water drowned out existing villages, Indian garden plots, and there was extensive gardening and farming prior to the arrival of whites. And it changed life dramatically. And just to fill in the picture a little bit, and I know this from first-hand accounts of people, old people whom I interviewed. In Lake Winnibigoshish, for example, there was an extended peninsular Ravens Point with a very old village standing on the end. And when the dam was built at the outlet of Lake Winnibigoshish, all Indian males were drafted, to put it politely, to work on the dam, even though they bitterly objected to the building of the dams, knowing what the dams would do. But at 5 o'clock in the morning, the government barge would be pulled up by a little tugboat to Ravens Point, and every male from preschool age up was loaded on board, taken across the lake to work on the construction of the dam, and brought back at nightfall. And they felt that they thus had to work as slaves, bringing about the demise of their village. And this was the case elsewhere too, Cass Lake, Leech Lake.
When I look back at the 40s when I was a kid, very small kid, and a lot of my memories comes from photographs. The fishing seemed to be quite spectacular. I have film footage of the 49 and 50. The walleyes didn't seem to be real big, pound and a half, 2 pounds, but extremely plentiful. And it's my opinion, of course, the fishing has dropped off dramatically. Any personal reason you could think of why it's dropped off? I might have my own reasons, but do you have any?
You know, the fishing and the hunting was always better when we were kids than it is now. And you can't base an ecological change on anecdote. Whether it is really true that the fish are smaller and not as plentiful, that the deer are smaller and not as plentiful, well, you can't base that on how I made out fishing and hunting last year. And remember then that when we old timers talk about it, the winters when we were kids were always colder, the snow was always deeper, and you young folks just don't know what it's all about.
You would forget, you left one thing out. You had to walk 5 miles to school. Albert Swenson said he used to walk to Bemidji to go to school.
That is true. Albert Swenson and the others who grew up around here and these are people who were born in the early 1900s and 19-teens, attended one-room schools that were scattered all over the countryside. And the one-room school nearest here nearest Lake Andrusia. There were two. One was at Buck Lake, and the building still stands and is now used as the Ten Lakes Town Hall. The other school was the Swenson Lake School, and that stood across the road from my driveway entrance and was in use until the 1950s. However, the children who attended these schools could only do the grades there. If they wanted a further education, they had to get their own way into Bemidji. Now, my respected neighbor Albert Swenson got to Bemidji by riding a horse, and when that was not feasible, by walking. Although I believe that during the worst of the winter, he stayed with relatives or friends in Bemidji, but not for any longer than was absolutely necessary, because he was needed at home to help take care of the farm.
Is there any other area you think would be of interest in the Lake Andrusia area that we haven't discussed in the past? We discussed the fishing. By the way, I do have film and footage, a lot of film showing the fish. I got my evidence. I've got my photographs. Now, does it mean anything? I don't know. We each measure a different way. What haven't I covered? I mean, I could have made a whole list out that would be forever. Andrusia, we know where it came from. We know where its name came from. Joe Pronto, the owner of Joe's Lodge, after somebody else built it, has told his daughter that Andrusia was much lower at one time. And at Joe's Point, you could walk way out into the lake because the lake was down. Photographs I've seen from my uncles in 1949, where I'm placed, the water was very high several times. So someplace between 1940 and 1920, there must have been a tremendous rise in the lake.
Bear in mind that just in the natural course of events, water levels fluctuate. They fluctuate greatly. And during the dust storm days of the 30s and the long drought, of course the water levels were lower. And there's one other reason why in the 20s and the 30s the water levels dropped. We logged so much of this country, and the forests and the trees retain moisture, that a consequence of the logging was that the water ran off and there was nothing to hold it. And this, in combination with Dust Bowl days, may well account for the low water levels.
When I talked to Albert, I said, my question was, were there a lot of big Norway and white pines? He kind of meekly said, well, no, there were clumps of it. And my imagination tells me that I would like to believe this place was just staggered with large trees. But what I'm hearing, they were just in groups.
Albert Swenson was born after this country was logged off. When he was a young boy, you could just about see all the way from Big Lake to Swenson Lake, because there was nothing in between. The trees had all been cut. And while I know this is anecdotal, I have been told third hand a description of what the country was like before the logging. That you could walk, for example, from the village of Red Lake to the village of Redby, distance of 4 or 5 miles. And that the canopy of the giant trees was so thick that at high noon you did not see the sun, and that you walked in semi-darkness. And that much of this land around here was covered by a mature pine forest. All of it, of course, not. You have lowlands where there would not be trees, but where the ground was high enough to support the trees, they were big, and it was a climax forest around here.
Now, the loggers missed the white pine in my yard. It looks like it's 200 to 300 years old. I don't know how they missed it, but they did, or I'd like to believe they left a few for seeding. I don't know if that's true or not. I think they just took everything in sight, but somehow they missed it. I have nothing else unless you can steer me in a direction that I haven't been. Again, I'm keeping the general history around Andrusia. We talked about the rivers, how it's changed and when, the villages, the resorts.
I have one more thing to say, and then we'll close. Everyone wants a place in the woods and on a lake. And if all of us have such a place, there will be no woods and lakeshore left. And somewhere, somehow, we have to find a balance between our individual desires and the quality of the land that we leave our children.